It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Julian Cribb. Julian is an Australian author, journalist, editor and science communicator. He's the founding editor of sciencealert.com.au, which has 5 million followers worldwide. He has received over 30 awards for journalism, published more than 8,000 articles and 9 books, including his latest Poisoned Planet, which he'll be discussing here today. Please join me in welcoming Julian to the stage.
Thank you very much indeed. Something larger and more dangerous even than climate change stalks the human future, and it's time we gave it the same attention. Most of us know that some chemicals are not good for us, but few people have much idea of the universal chemical deluge to which we are now all subject 24/7. Earth and all life on it are now being saturated with human chemical emissions in an event unlike anything that has occurred in the whole 4 billion years of our planet's history. At almost every moment of our lives, from conception to death, we are exposed to thousands of man-made substances, some of them known to be deadly in even minute doses, and most of them unknown in their effects on our health, our well-being, and upon the natural world. These enter our bodies with every breath, each meal, each drink, the clothes we wear, the products we adorn ourselves with, our homes, our workplaces, furniture, the things we encounter every day. There is no escaping them. Ours is a poisoned planet, its whole system infused with the substances we deliberately or inadvertently produce in the course of extracting, making, using, burning, or discarding the many marvellous products on which modern life depends. This has all happened so fast that most people are still unaware of its extent or of the dangers that it poses to us and to our grandkids. Now, currently, humans are manufacturing 143,000 different chemicals, around a third of which are suspected of being responsible for cancers, mutations and birth defects, brain damage, or are toxic in some way. However, the United Nations Environment Programme warns most of these chemicals have never been properly tested for health or safety. And think about that for a moment. I mean, you wouldn't get on an aeroplane that had never been tested before. You wouldn't get in a motor car that had never been tested before. But you are subject to thousands of things every day that have never been tested. Global output of industrial chemicals is around 30 million tonnes a year, and it is on track to triple by the mid-century. However, these deliberately made chemicals are just the tip of the iceberg. For example, we, collectively, us humans, emit 130 million tonnes of nitrogen and phosphorus as we feed ourselves, mainly as we feed ourselves. 400 million tonnes of hazardous waste, including 50 million tonnes of old computers and mobile phones, 13 billion tonnes of coal, oil and gas, 30 billion tonnes of mineral wastes, 35 billion tonnes of carbon, and 75 billion tonnes of topsoil. Every meal you eat actually is costing the planet 10 kilograms of topsoil. Think about that. Not to mention all the other things that we know about and love: nuclear and chemical weapons, illicit and legal drugs, cement, vehicle and industrial fumes, nanoparticles, and so on. You add all of that together, it adds up to about 150 billion tonnes a year of chemicals that we, the human race, are moving around this planet. And it is by far our biggest impact. I mean, it's actually 4 times the size of our climate emissions. What effect is it having? Well, there are thousands of scientific reports. You can go, if you know where to look, you can go on the internet and find them. They're piling up, documenting in disturbing detail the impact that this flood is having on our health and on our future. But because these reports are scattered across dozens, even hundreds of different scientific journals, many different scientific disciplines in scores of countries, for society as a whole, we're not getting the big picture. We're just seeing a few fragments of the jigsaw. Maybe we're worried about pesticides, maybe we're worried about endocrine disruptors, or what's in our cosmetics, or in our soap, or something like that. In Poisoned Planet, what I've attempted to do is piece all of this together so that we can understand the potential chemical impact that humans are having on the Earth system and on ourselves. And also to propose a practical solution to it. The science now shows that our chemical emissions are moving relentlessly around the planet. In water, in air, in soil, in wildlife, in fish, in food, in trade, in people, and in our genes. Researchers are finding man-made chemicals from the stratosphere to the deep oceans, from the peak of Mount Everest, where the snow is too polluted to drink by Australian standards, to remote Pacific atolls, to the Arctic and to the Antarctic. These substances are routinely found by researchers in birds, fish, mammals, and other life forms that have never had contact with human beings, as well as throughout our food chain. Tests show that the average modern citizen is a walking contaminated site. The US Centers for Disease Control, for example, does a regular survey of 2,000 Americans, and it finds certain industrial chemicals of concern in the blood of the vast majority. That's 80 or 90% of them. The US Environmental Working Group, in independent tests, found 414 industrial toxins in 186 people that it looked at, ranging in age from newborns to grandparents. And then it did a special study of newborn babies. It looked at the cord blood, and it found that they were contaminated with dioxins, flame retardants, and known carcinogens. So, our babies are coming into this world already charged with a cargo of things that can do them ill. Now, these tests, although they're small, and we should be doing them here in Australia, but we're not, but they have raised such concern among scientists that 7 enormous studies, 100,000 infants in each one, have been set up in 7 countries around the world. And they are trying to look at the issue that I'm really driving at here is the total toxic burden. I mean, individually, these things, you might be able to survive them, they might do you no harm. The issue is, what are they doing to your health and the health of your offspring in combination? It's the mixtures that is the real concern. So our babies are born with these things in their blood, and the first thing they do when they suckle their mother's milk, they get a mouthful of pesticides. That is so in China, it's so in America, it's so in 15 countries in Europe. I dare say if we looked here, we'd find similar things. The United Nations Environment Programme estimates about 5 million people die, and 86 million are disabled every year by chemicals directly. But that does not include the millions more cases where chemicals are implicated in cancers, heart disease, obesity, and mental disorders. These chemicals, both the intentional ones and the unintentional ones, are interacting with tens of thousands of other substances. So we're producing a cascade of these products in our environment to form potentially billions of mixtures. And the impact of this is not clear. The research has not been done, but suspicions are rising. When you look at the scientific literature, there's enough smoke to say that there's a fire there somewhere. For example, the eminent Harvard medical professor, Philippe Grandjean, in an article in The Lancet about 2 months ago, called on all countries to transform their chemical risk assessment procedures in order to protect children from everyday toxins that may be causing a global silent epidemic of brain development disorders. In a recent report on endocrine disrupting chemicals, the World Health Organization and UNEP warned that reproductive and other hormonal disorders are on the rise globally, that man-made substances are implicated by more and more laboratory studies, and that the scale of the problem has probably been underestimated. Falling sperm counts in males all around the planet, reduced fertility in females, genital deformities, changes in gender and sexual orientation are now all thought to have links or be mediated by man-made chemicals. But there are 2 really important points in this. First, this chemical assault is quite new. Most of it has happened in the last 50 years. It is something that our ancestors never faced, right? So we're really the first generation to cop this full on. Second, its impacts are for the most part preventable and avoidable. The big question is, does society wish to prevent or avoid them? Now, every year, about 1,000 new chemicals are released onto world markets, most of them without proper health, safety, or environmental screening. Regulation has so far banned just 18 out of the 143,000 chemicals registered. At such a rate of progress, it's going to take us the next 50,000 years to assess and ban everything that's bad for us. So clearly, national regulation is not providing the answers that we, the people, would seek. This is a global problem. It's like climate change in that. There has to be a shared solution here. We can't just leave it up to these governments that are going to dither and listen to various lobbies and things like that. A disturbing feature is that the chemical industry over the last 10 years increasingly has been relocating out of the Western world and mainly into Asia, but increasingly into Africa, where it is generally not regulated at all or very poorly regulated, or the regime is corrupt or whatever. And we saw this, the ABC Four Corners program had an example last year. We banned dioxin in Australia back in the 1980s, but you can go down your friendly local garden centre now and buy herbicide containing dioxin, which has been, remember dioxin was the element in Agent Orange that caused such a concern during the Vietnam War. So you can buy that in Australia even though it's banned, and probably the garden centres don't even know they're selling it. It's just the result of a bad manufacturing process in a third world country. And the issue is this, that the toxic emissions of this translocated chemical industry are coming back to the citizens all the world over. I mean, when Americans take a deep lungful of air, they're getting a whole lot of Chinese pollution. Well, we already knew that, but we're starting to see things that only the Chinese can produce, and they're coming back in the atmosphere. They're coming back in water. They're coming back in wildlife. I mean, the squid that were found in the deep Atlantic with flame retardants, honestly, a squid with flame retardants, can you imagine anything that a squid really doesn't need more than flame retardants? But they came out of furniture, they somehow got into the deep oceans, they go up the food chain into the dolphins and the whales and the tuna and the things that eat squid, and then they come back to us. So these things are cyclical. The arsenic that just gets blown away from the soil in India, it ends up in the snow on Mount Everest, it comes back down the Indus River or the Ganges River, and it ends up in the food supply again. So these things are cycling around and around, and because a chemical was used 10 years or 20 years ago doesn't mean it's gone away. If it's a tough chemical or if it's a heavy metal, it's still in circulation. So when we think about the 8,000 tonnes of mercury that comes out of our coal-fired stations, power stations every year, that is coming out. That's cumulative. That mercury is not going away. They found it in polar bears in the North Pole. They found it in penguins in the South Pole. We'll find it in all of us because it's come to us through the tuna we eat or the swordfish or whatever. The world was awakened to the risks of chemical pollution 50 years ago. It's more than 50 years, I can't believe that, by Rachel Carson, of course, when she wrote her wonderful book, Silent Spring, where she warned specifically about pesticides in agriculture. But since she wrote that warning, the volume of pesticides in use worldwide has increased 30-fold. Now, don't get me wrong, chemicals and minerals are valuable and extremely useful. They do great good. They save many lives and much money, and no one is suggesting they should all be banned. But their value may count for little if the current uncontrolled, unmonitored, unregulated, and unconscionable mass release and planetary saturation continues. Now, since the poisoning of the people of Minamata in the 1950s and 60s, there's been a string of high-profile chemical scandals and many lesser ones. The Love Canal, Seveso, Bhopal, Erin Brockovich and the town of Hinckley. Most recently, Fukushima and the Indian school lunch tragedy. The one thing that these all have in common is that the victims are invariably forced by the combined might of industry and government to prove that they have been harmed. And that's very hard to do. I mean, look how long it took to prove that cigarettes were bad for you. And especially when the industry doesn't want it proved. My point is that there is now a pattern of unproductive confrontation between angry citizens and industry and regulators, which usually ends in long drawn-out legal battles that deliver justice to nobody. An important point in my book is that blaming industry and calling for tougher regulation is not going to solve the problem of the poisoned planet. We need to find smarter ways to protect society and future generations. And that starts with us realising that we are the ones at fault. We are the ones who send out the market signals that lead to the mass production and the ill-considered release of toxins. We want our food to be cheap. Okay, it's produced with pesticides to make it cheap. We want the latest in, plastic things around the house. But we take little account of what we breathe in as a result. We want our food to be safe. We take no account of the plastic it comes wrapped in that keeps it safe from bacteria but emits other things. Every act of consumption on a crowded planet has chemical consequences. Think about that. Whatever you buy, whatever you use in your life, has a chemical knock-on effect, up the chain and down the chain. And those consequences are now, in all likelihood, causing a toll which is larger than the annual toll in World War II. It's astonishing to me that nobody seems to have noticed this. So in a sense, we are all getting away with murder. Now, this is an uncomfortable thought, but I believe it is essential to modern society taking effective action to clean up the earth and protect our children into the future. If we have given rise to this problem by demanding goods which are produced using toxic substances or toxic processes, then we alone have the power to correct it. It is already clear that governments do not have the capacity or the will to regulate a global toxic flood. Regulation is important, but if we rely on rules alone to protect our children, the evidence so far is that they will not deliver. In a globalised world, only we the people are powerful enough as consumers to send the market signals to industry to cease toxic emissions. Especially if that industry happens to be in China or India or somewhere, they're not going to listen to any regulatory signals, are they? They'll only listen to people not buying their products. And we also have to properly reward industry that produces clean, safe, healthy products or services. For the first time in human history, we have the means to share a universal understanding of a common threat and what we can each do to mitigate it. Through the internet and social media, concerned citizens and parents are already mobilising around the world, reaching one another across borders, cultural, ethnic, religious, linguistic and economic divides. Good, concerned people and parents are joining hands at light speed to cleanse our poisoned planet. And this is an expression of people power and global democracy like no other that we've ever experienced before. Tens of thousands of people are now sharing this information on the internet. I see it every day when I open Twitter or Facebook or one of those. They're joining hands. Within a year or two, it's going to be tens of millions. And then it's going to be hundreds of millions. So this is an idea whose time has come. I mean, if there is nothing that unifies the human race, it must, the only thing that must be is a common threat that we face together. With that power, you can encourage clean processes like green chemistry, which the chemists want to invent. They're already working on it, but it's not getting any traction because the consumer demand to pull the clean products through is not there at the moment. So we need this awareness, the kind of awareness that's put out by the US Breast Cancer Foundation, for example, or the Environmental Working Group, or the Food Disorders website, which was set up in Australia, eating disorders and so on. Far from being harmful to industry, this universal demand for clean, safe products will open fresh markets, generate more jobs, build new companies, and build greater prosperity. And I am proud to note that Australian scientists are at the forefront in the push to clean up the world. The Global Contamination Initiative is the brainchild of Professor Ravi Naidu of CRC Care in South Australia. Finally, I would say to you that every one of us has a right to life, to liberty, to personal security, to marriage, family, equality, work, education, to freedom of belief, to freedom from torture. These rights are available to us, each under the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It is more than a little concerning to find there is no human right not to be poisoned. Until and unless we have such a right, there will probably never again be a day in history when we and our children are not poisoned. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for quite a sobering but also inspiring speech. I'm going to open to the floor for questions. Please raise your hand nice and high if anyone has anything they'd like to ask Julian. Right here.
I'll be the bunny. I've often had this, I don't know, dream or something. I'm reading a terrific Aboriginal book at the moment. I think, why don't we go back and be naked, eh? Not have to wear clothes and the chemicals and all that produce. But also, I always have this feeling of doing it, but I never have done it. Like, I think one of the latest things to impact on the environment are these new coffee pots. They don't disintegrate. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know what.
Yeah, there's new coffee, people buying coffee machines for their own home now, and you buy this little pod of coffee thing, and they don't disintegrate.
Yeah.
I always feel like making a label and going to the supermarket and sticking it on the sign there saying, warning, this does not disintegrate. Maybe we could have a commercial, a lot of stickers that we could all go around and stick them everywhere so people get the message.
Well, I think that's a very sound idea. And I mean, with enough people protesting about enough products, the message will start to get through. And I mean, it's clear that the message does get through. I mean, if we think about it, 10 years ago, all the eggs in the supermarket were from battery farms, you know, and tortured chickens, you know. Look at all the different eggs. I know we've had problems with the definition of free range and what have you, but there are free range and lower cruelty eggs available, you know, to you now. That's clearly as a result of consumer pressure on supermarkets. The organic food, you know, display in the supermarket is much larger than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. The farmers' markets in this country, in New Zealand, in America, in Britain, they're booming because people are shopping, you know, for things that they think are lower in contamination. Not completely free of it, but lower. So it's starting to happen. And as I say, on these websites, I'm seeing a lot of information being shared among people on what to avoid and, you know, which brands are the better brands. Especially women's cosmetics, there's a lot of advice out there, you know, what not to wash your hair with in the morning. You know, so it's starting to get around. Admittedly, it's the affluent middle class that are sharing this information now, but middle class revolutions have a habit of getting traction. So I think it's going to go right through society as we progress.
Yes, look, one of the problems I see is that your message is sort of counterintuitive because we all seem to be living longer, the health, you know, life expectancy is going up. People generally tend to feel much more healthy probably than our ancestors were.
Yeah.
So that, and even in the third world where there's still disasters, people seem to be moving out of poverty and living longer.
Yeah. Well, yes, because of vaccines and antibiotics. So we're about to lose antibiotics. So this may not continue for much longer. So the life expectancy data is retrospective. Okay? It applies to what's happened in the past. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the future. A lot of people are frightened that the obesity pandemic is going to actually reverse the gains that we've made. If we lose antibiotics, those gains will be reversed very fast. So, you know, there are a whole lot of issues around that. It's very hard to predict how life expectancy is going to go. It'll continue to go up in some countries, it'll plateau in others, and it'll go backwards. So the fact that a child born today expects to live for 83 or 86 years doesn't mean to say that that child will. And you've got to ask yourself, you know, what about this absolute avalanche of mental disorders that's happening? I mean, it's not my recollection that I grew up, you know, that 1 person in 5 had a mental disease, but that is the case today. Where's it all coming from? The brain is the most sensitive organ in your body to chemical signals. That's why people take drugs, okay? Because, you know, the brain, you get a big hit in the brain. It's the compounding effect of all of these things. And the warning that I'm hanging out is that whatever is happening today is going to be 3 times that within 30, 40 years as the chemical industry migrates to China and India. So we should start finding ways to control it now. And I think consumers just saying, hey, we want clean, safe stuff is going to do a lot better than relying on governments who are very often compromised by their relationships with big companies.
During my career in the government laboratory here in Victoria, I worked on there was a survey of pesticide residues, mercury in fish. Pesticide residues covered the dairy industry in the Western Districts of Victoria when there was an outbreak of an organochlorine pesticide residue in milk and animals. And even there was a survey of breast milk. And none of this stuff has ever been published as far as I'm aware. How do you actually get the government to release information about these sort of surveys?
Well, one of the problems we have is that how do you actually get the government even to continue those kinds of surveys? Because my understanding from the people I speak to in the bureaucracy in Canberra perhaps, I mean, the Market Basket Survey, which is supposed to test our food for residues of undesirable chemicals, not just pesticides, but also wrapping chemicals and preservative chemicals and what have you, it hasn't been completely discontinued. I mean, it used to be done on a regular basis every quarter in a large selection of supermarkets across Australia. But it's been reduced to a bare bones type thing. It's done about once a year, and you're right, they don't publish the results. Although the results are encouraging as so far as pesticides are concerned, but I don't believe they're looking at the food wrappings. I mean, we only use a few hundred pesticides, but there are something like 3,000 or 4,000 food wrapping chemicals or food preserving chemicals. So it's questionable whether the threat starts on the farm. The bigger threat is on the farm or in the factory. But the other thing is that Australia is importing more and more of its food. 30% of our fruit, 20% of our vegetables, 80% of our fish is coming from China or India or Vietnam or Thailand or somewhere like that now. And those countries do not have good regimes for checking. We have a pretty good regime for making sure farmers withhold their produce from the market if it's been sprayed. You're supposed to wait for the breakdown date on the chemicals, but doesn't apply to Bassa fillets in your supermarket or whatever. So we're importing more and I know this because I work with scientists who have tested this stuff and they've found surprisingly high levels. So the short answer is that we're not getting the message we need. Americans are not getting it. Europeans, oddly enough, are. The European community had 1,000 pesticides used on farms only a few years ago. They've now got 250, and their production has not gone down, which tells you two things. First of all, you can get rid of an awful lot of agricultural chemicals. And secondly, it doesn't make any damn difference. So there's now, of course, this big... and the other thing is we go through phases. We banned DDT, and then we got very scared about the organophosphates. And now we're onto the neonicotinoids. And, of course, everyone's panicking because honeybees are dying out around the world, and neonics have been strongly implicated by Harvard University, Penn State, Duke University, a whole bunch of reputable universities are now saying, whoa, these things are killing the bees. And the bees produce $1/3 trillion worth of food a year. So, they're a big part of the world. 10% of the world food supply, if you like, is mediated by bees. So we need to be concerned about these things, and we need to ask, why do we just experiment by putting them out there? Why don't we check them first?
Sorry, we've got one more question.
I've got a question. Just fairly recently, I remember reading a CSIRO article where they did a study into organic foods as opposed to over-the-counter foods. And they found no perceptible difference nutritionally between them. I'd like you...
Do you say a small difference?
No.
No difference
no
nutrition?
No difference, yes. I'd like your comment on that because that's very surprising.
Yeah, it may be true. It's the concern wouldn't be whether there's much nutritional difference, but it's whether there are any residues from the pesticides that may have been used in the conventional farming system. I think our system in Australia is pretty good on making sure the residues aren't too bad, but some things always get through the net. Even in Europe, where they're much tougher, things get through the net. So pesticides are finding their way in there. But as I say, I think the main concern is at the manufacturing and processing stage. But I would say this. Today, because of the fact that we've been using NPK fertilisers for a century nearly, the soils have actually been mined of micronutrients to a large degree. And if you eat a tomato, you would have to eat 5 tomatoes today. This is American data, all right? I haven't got Australian data. Or 5 cauliflowers to get the same amount of minerals and micronutrients as your grandparents got. Right? Because a lot of those things have been run down. We're talking about very small things, selenium and so on, which are not... those things are nevertheless associated by many medical researchers with certain disease states. So that probably all of our food, is the short answer, is not as nutritious as it used to be, and you've got to eat more of it to get the same amount of nutrition. But I don't know, I'm not aware of any really credible studies that have been done on the difference between organic systems, and there's many of those, and traditional systems, and there's many of those.